Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is a very special moment for all of us here, colleagues and friends, and people joining us today for this, what is arguably a very important discussion on 20 years after Bashar al-Assad's succession to power in Syria in 2000. I have with me five stellar speakers who will be joining us very shortly. They are with us, but I will be sharing some things about this event. We have Omar Dahi, Katil Hayek, myself, Bassam Haddad, Ibrahim Hamidi, Lisa Wedin, and Basilius Zeno. And I will be sharing to the extent possible as much about them as we can. But first, let me share that we are starting with a discussion of what happened in Syria in 2000. In early summer of the year 2000, Hafiz al-Assad, who ruled Syria for 30 years, died. He was succeeded by his son Bashar Assad in a meticulously engineered grooming process that sidelined many of Syria's strongmen, paving the way for an uncontested succession that required a constitutional change to match Bashar's relatively young age. In more than one way, it was a formidable challenge to succeed Assad the father, not least in terms of his authority within the regime and delicate balancing act that allowed him to maintain his grip on power with few challenges. Two of them are the Muslim Brotherhood's uprising in the 70s and early 80s, and the second is his brother's challenge to his rule, also in the early to mid 80s. However, Syrians were fed up by 2000 with the repressive rule, economic disparities, cronyism, corruption, rising prices, decrepit public institutions, lack of job opportunities, and a constant brain drain of skilled and less skilled Syrians who sought opportunities elsewhere. Bashar Assad assumed power in July 2000, promising modernization and change with continuity in order to balance a better future with the authority and stability of the past. Starting with what was briefly called the Damascus Spring, which promised a political opening, and ending with the dubious announcement in 2005 of the social market economy, which promised better economic opportunities. Instead, and to no dramatic surprise, what Syrians experienced henceforth was deeper social and economic polarization, leading to the regionally spurred uprisings in 2011 and the mayhem that ensued. We are here to discuss the journey with our colleagues, Omar Dahi, Associate Professor of Economics at Hampshire College, Katil Hayek, a PhD candidate in communication at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Myself, I'm an associate professor at Charles School of Policy and Government and director of Middle East Studies at George Mason University. Ibrahim Hamidi is a Syrian journalist based in London. Lisa Wedin is the Mary R. Morton Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago, and Basilius Zeno is a Syrian archaeologist and a PhD candidate in political science at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. So I'd like to start with asking Omar, our first speaker in the lineup, to address his thoughts. These are very basic personal and or analytical thoughts that have to do with the transition. What was on your mind? How did you take the news? What were your thoughts about the next period to come in context of what had been said? Because much of the discussion on Syria at the time is that the regime might not survive the death of Assad. And of course, that was not the case. We'll start with Omar and then we'll go down the list. Each person will speak for about 1 to 3 minutes, and then we'll talk a bit more about other topics related to the transition, to the early Bashar years, and the 10 years in power that preceded the uprisings. And then, if we are able to take questions, if there is a time, we're allotting about 90 minutes for this discussion. We will take questions off of Facebook. So feel free to address us via Facebook, and we will do our best to capture all the questions. Omar Dahi.
Hi, Bassam and everyone. Thank you for having me. So I guess when you asked us to be here and told us a little bit about what we're going to be talking about, I tried to start my best recreating my thoughts and trying to remember exactly where I was when this happened 20 years ago. At that time, actually, I was not. I was in the U.S. I wasn't in Syria anymore, and I was in between college and graduate school. It was the summer I had graduated from college and went to graduate school. And I remember watching on TV from Long Beach, California, the funeral procession. And one sentiment that I had was, disbelief. Really, I think if I remember correctly, that was the one prevailing thought that I had, that I couldn't believe this was happening. It was a shock in some ways. It wasn't an emotional, uh, uh, you know, investment that I had at the moment. More that I was born in 1978, grew up in Syria, sort of basically my whole life under Hafiz al-Assad. So couldn't quite believe that he had actually died. And half jokingly, I remember turning to my brother and having this, only half jokingly thinking that he's not actually dead. He's actually still alive, orchestrating this whole thing, and watching to see how everyone is going to react to this his apparent death, and then make decisions. It was such was the hold that he had on our minds, I suppose, that we could entertain this somewhat absurd thought, I suppose. Um, in a sense, I mean, I think a lot, as many people now know, there's this binary of, did people think he was Bashar coming to power was a reformer or not a reformer, or was this a dawn of a new era? Um, if I recall correctly, as at that point, sort of a civilian, I hadn't started researching Syria in any systematic way. I was to come a few years later. It was much more a sense of relief that people had. So, in a sense, it was not perhaps the framing of reformer or dawn of a new era was something that, maybe that was an argument that people had in their minds, but I think it was a lot of external framing, looking into Syria and thinking about this. I think for a lot of people that I knew in Syria, it was, among the possible outcomes that could happen, this could be the least worst outcome. I mean, I think people who are familiar with the country, for example, felt that had his elder brother been the one to take power, things would have somehow been much worse had he survived the car accident, because he was much more aggressive, perhaps, and militaristic, and much more likely to clamp down. So I think there was a sense, I would say, of relief that among the possible outcome scenarios, which could be chaotic or could be perhaps there was going to be infighting, or there was going to be a lot of uh, um, instability, or perhaps someone who is worse than Hafiz al-Assad take power, there was, I think, at that time, a sense of relief. And at least that's what I felt at the time. I don't know others, what their recollections were, but that was one of the prevailing thoughts that I had.
Thank you very much, Omar. Kati, do you have any reflections on the transition and the immediate post-transition period, whether personal or analytical?
Yes, I have actually. I was very young. I was 13 years old when Hafiz al-Assad died, and I remember I was in huge shock. Like someone told me that God died. Like I was born in very apolitical environment. I knew that my grandfather was at some point communist, but when I was born and during my childhood, no one talked about politics. I knew that there was something bad in our history, but I never figured out what was it. And I actually, as a scholar and as an individual, I became like I had the feminist awareness, and at very young age I became atheist, and I questioned like religion as a whole system at age 16. But it took me several years until I went to college and in Damascus, and until I like had access to different people experience to like question dictatorship and authoritarianism. That's why now as a scholar I'm like very interested in agency, like how people negotiate their agency within structures of like hegemony and authoritarianism and dictatorship. um, and I remember the day he died, like in in 2000, that there was like all this like symbolic propaganda going among kids. I remember that I was with my cousins like looking at the moon because there was like this rumor that his face is printed in the moon. I don't know if other remember that. So yeah, it was I think for a lot of people in my generation a shock, like who were, which I think a lot of us like who were born in the 80s, because of what happened in the early 80s, like our parents wanted for us to be very apolitical generation. But later, when Bashar came to power, there was hope, like about like internet communication technology, that we will be like modernized, about NGO rule in society. And there was also fears because he came to power. We have to remember that it was at the time when American invasion of Iraq happened, like later in the early 2000s. So Syrians were afraid of any alternative. Like if we will like do anything in our country, we will have the destiny of Iraq. Look what's happening in Iraq. Look what's happening in Palestine. So there was always that fear present.
Thank you. Thanks, Kati. Brahim, from your vantage point, let us know what your thoughts are. Just to share that in 2000, and I will share my comments in a bit, I was actually in Damascus when Assad died, and Ibrahim was there, and I actually was myself at Arif Dalila's house when we heard the news, and I'll share that story. And Ibrahim was one of my major interlocutors when I was finishing research for my book. Ibrahim, please. You are muted.
Okay, sorry. Now it's fine. Thank you,
Yes, sir.
Bassam. Yeah, it's great to see you. It's great to see everybody. I think I have a bit different experience from Kathy and maybe of Omar. I mean, I was there. I mean, I was there. Of course, Syria, but the same. I was there as a journalist. By then, I was very much involved in covering the whole succession story, covering the whole Salon. I mean, the whole Syria Salon's activities. So for me, to be very honest, I mean, I was not very much shocked that Assad died because that was expected because he was in the last few years, he was, I mean, between 1998 until 2000, he was sick. And even when he met with the former president of America, Bill Clinton, March 2000, that we knew as, I mean, I knew as a journalist that maybe that was the last summit between the two presidents. So his death was expected, at least from my perspective. A, B, to be once again honest, maybe as a journalist, because I knew what was happening in the inner circle, I reported a lot about it. So I did not expect any tough transition. Actually, I expected the transition to be very smooth from Assad the father to Assad the son. I did not expect big blow, big problem within the regime. So in a way, as expected, maybe there was a little bit of disruption for 1 or 2 days when the former vice president Hamid Khaddam disagreed. But I mean, all happened as expected. I mean, he was the Syrian constitution has been amended, and then like the regional command of Ba'ath Party, the parliament being head of the army. I mean, exactly as was written in the playbook. So it was a transition. It was a smooth transition. The other point is that I think maybe Omar mentioned it, is that at that time the expectations were very, very high among the Syrians. That okay, I mean, you remember he was called the hope. Assad is the Bashar is the hope. That the expectations among the Syrians were very high. That okay, now especially when he came to power, you know, there were like the civil salons, the opposition activities was very tolerated by the government, by the regime. So the expectations that okay, Bashar came, to power, in a way there was sort of silent trade-off between the regime and the Syrians, that, okay, we would tolerate, we would accept this transition, but in return, we need really reforms in the political system, the economic system. We need more opening. We need more, to move from the regime that we knew for 30 years to new regime. That was the hope. And maybe we'll talk about what happened after and why it happened this way. Maybe we'll talk about it later. But I would like to tackle one last point, which is, for me, I really, to understand what's happening now after 20 years, for me, we need to go back to what was happening in 2000. One of the symbolic indications was the funeral of the late President Al-Asad. You remember 10th of June? I was in Damascus again, of course. I was reporting for Al-Hayat newspaper. I remember, for me, the funeral of the late president, maybe if I'm not mistaken, and I would like to hear your view, and maybe Lisa and the other colleagues' view, maybe that was the only funeral where you could see all contradictions of the Middle East, where you could see, like, the Crown Prince, the former Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Abdullah bin Abdulaziz, and the Iranian president, Mohammad Khatami by then, the Turkish president with the Saudis, the Americans, the former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, with the French president Jacques Chirac, and the Iranians with the Turkish president. So everybody was there. Maybe the only one who was not at the funeral represented the Israelis. Otherwise, everybody. Why I'm saying that? I'm saying that at that point, the funeral was a reflection of the Syrian role, Syria role in the whole region. It was a regional player, you could tell. And it was, former President Assad conducted and maintained very balanced foreign policy. He was able to work with the Americans and the Soviets and then the Russians, with the Saudis and the Iranians, with the Turks and the Saudis and the Iranians and the Egyptians, with Arafat and his opponents among the Palestinian factions. So he was, in a way, bringing all contradictions together, and he was a regional player. He / Syria. Of course, now things have changed after 20 years. Maybe we'll talk about that later.
Shukran. Thank you, Ibrahim. Let's go to Lisa. I actually thought that Lisa Wadeen has a last name that cannot be beaten in terms of the alphabet, in terms of somebody coming after her, but Basilios Zeno beat her because his last name starts with a Z. So, Lisa,
sorry for that.
Well, I'm happy to go wherever you want me to go, and thank you, Bassam, for inviting me and for being part of this remarkable group. I agree with Ibrahim that I wasn't particularly surprised that Hafez al-Assad died when he did. He had been ailing for years. You asked where we were. I was doing field work in Yemen at the time, but I can't recall whether I was there or returning, because I was going back and forth to the US and to Yemen a lot because I had a young child. But I do recall being struck by the tone and content of Bashar al-Assad's inaugural speech. He enjoined Syrians to engage in creative thinking, if you remember, and constructive criticism. He seemed to champion transparency and democracy. And for some Syrians, as many of you have already mentioned, including people in the opposition, his speech was refreshing. It gave some hope that substantive reforms would be carried out. And of course, we know 20 years later that they were endlessly deferred. The emergence, though, of the fora, the Muntadiyat, where lively discussions about politics happened, where people were able to grasp on to the promises of political opening in order to create space or a wedge for that opening. These fora were ultimately too challenging for the regime to manage, but they were adumbrated or enjoined into being, if you will, by the speech. And over the course of the year 2000 to 2001, they were where a new kind of political vitality resided. It reminded me a lot of the parties that I had started to attend and was writing about in Yemen. In other words, the possibility for a democratic politics in the absence of a democratic regime.
Thank you, Lisa. Basil?
Unmuted. Yeah, thank you so much.
You have some feedback.
The baby. So I recall that day. It's unforgettable day. I grew up in Sweden. I was visiting friends in Salamiyeh. I was 17 years old, and I was playing oud, like visiting the friend outside, like people sat outside their doors, when someone came and hushed us and said, there's something happening, like something big, without, it's as if you can't mention his name until the official Syrian TV announced that. So it's not a joke, you can't joke about this. So we didn't take that seriously until the mom of my friend came to us and say, hush, hush, go play inside. And then we watched, which is the irony, like we continued, but then the news, it was evening. I remember Sheikhu, his name was Sheikhu, he announced his death. And then there was an emergency meeting for in the Syrian parliament. And then for 40 days, we had classical music, which was sad, but beautiful. But the question is, no one was surprised that Bashar al-Assad was the heir. Actually, the slogan, Allah Suriya Bashar Bas, was immediately proliferated, like even in the procession in June 13, 2000, you will hear it for the first time. So, after 1994, when Bashar al-Assad died, we started to see all these images of the Holy Trinity, Bashar, Hafiz, and Bashar al-Assad. So Bashar was, as Brahim said, the hope. And in 1998, if you remember, Hafiz al-Assad was visiting Iraq, and Iraq was visiting Syria. So, and Bashar was doing like an official visit. So he was in the forefront that he would be the president. And he was a civilian, and all of a sudden he is in the army. So it wasn't a surprise, but there was a question that I remember vividly, that people were asking, what will happen after that? So we all know that Bashar will become the president, but there is a fear because we never grew up with an alternative. The question of alternative is vague, and this sense of vagueness produced a sense of anxiety, even though we know offhand that the Bashar would be the president. But there was this complexity, as if you have two identities. One knows what will happen, and the other is not sure that will happen. And finally, I would say, like, the reaction of people that you observe at the time depends on the localities where you were residing. In Salamiyeh, there wasn't this kind of mass hysteria that we saw in Damascus or organized. In Sweden as well. But when I visited Sweden, I heard rumors that people were expecting a coup d'etat. And I heard the name of Salim Hatoum again. That was weird, super weird. So yeah, that was my recall. So it wasn't a surprise, but there was a sense of fear, of course. And it was obvious that they were trying to mimic the funerary of Jamal Abdel Nasser. And yeah, that's my two cents memory.
Shukran. Thank you, Basil. I myself actually was in Damascus. As I shared, I was at Arif Dalila's home. We were in the living room. He was basically one of the main sources of a good deal of my political economy research, including himself being a central figure in the network of economists in Syria. So we were talking, and all of a sudden we hear the news, and to my surprise, and mind you, this is a person who was jailed for several years while he was sick by the regime, henceforth, and was one of the most courageous, outspoken critics of the regime, who actually would make others shudder in the room when he was speaking at the regime at a conference, including what is called the Tuesday meetings. These are economic fora that were held in Syria in the 1990s and were very important. So when he heard the news, he went like this: Asad Mat. And for me, I mean, somebody who highly respected him, I was like, why is he reacting that way? And we talked about it, and I asked him about his shock, and he basically told me that that not just for him but for others, Assad was, a dictator, of course, but he's all that so many people knew, and the lived experience in Syria for 30 years, for what for all reasons, was connected to his presence, and so it was a bit of um, a shock, and the word shock doesn't mean anything negative or positive. So that was a major event. Now, of course, there had been a number of circles addressing the transition before, because we knew that Assad was having a failing health issue. And at least in some aspects or circles in political science, there was this discussion of Syria and Syrian institutions and the Syrian regime and the Syrian political system was patrimonial or neo-patrimonial, and therefore institutions are not likely to survive a major transition or a peaceful transition, and so on and so forth. But many of us had, like Ibrahim and others, and myself, who actually not just thought but also wrote about how the transition is likely to be smooth as a result of the various forms of preparations that were taken ahead of time by Assad when he pulled Bashar from London in 1994, after his older son Basil was killed or died in a car crash, his own car, driving his own car. It was an accident, and then groomed him for several years and paved the way for him, as I said in the introduction, so that other strongmen in Syria are either sidelined before he was to succeed him, or were neutralized by other strongmen, which is the game that Hafiz Assad perfected for 30 years, this balancing act that he conducted. And sure enough, many of us thought that the transition will be smooth, and that whatever needs to happen, including changing the constitution, will happen, and people will stand up and clap in the parliament for every, I guess, period in a sentence, at the end of the sentence, which is what happened. But the more perhaps informed analysts were concerned and were looking to see what's going to happen next, because Assad was aware, Bashar Assad was aware of the difficulties and the problems in Syria in ways that many Syrians were, but of course, he was not in a position to address them as fully as most Syrians would. And the challenge was to deal with what can be called, to be crude here because we don't have much time, the hardliners in the regime, to negotiate with them as to how to move forward. Bashar Assad, and I'll say this and stop, didn't have the quote unquote, the cult of personality, the charisma, the authority that his father had. So he had to rule not in a manner that was as singular, even if Hafiz Assad was also not ruling in an absolutely singular manner. He did have strong men around him. And yes, I say strong men for the most part because they were men. So in many ways, Bashar Assad tried to balance between the need for change, which he called, or his team called, modernization, because you don't want to use the word democratization or political opening or anything of that sort. So he used the word, or they used the word modernization in order to speak of the new horizon in Syria. But in every single speech, almost, and in most government pronunciations and discourse announcements or and discourses, the phrase change within continuity was evident, either verbatim or as a concept, because of the need to benefit from the existing stability and legacy of the Assad father on the one hand, whether or not repression was on the radar for the regime at the time. It was really more about having the strings of power within one's hand at the very top. And then, of course, the need for change, which is the reason why, I mean, we can all critique from afar, the reason why many Syrians were hopeful, and Syrians that basically opposed, despised, were harmed by, or even were less opposed to the regime than others. They were all hopeful that things will change. And of course, the Damascus Spring, which lasted a very short period, was what people invested in. And apparently it fell apart for various reasons, which I'd like to address with everyone here. Basically, the early years after Bashar took power, in terms of the Damascus Spring efforts and the groups and the fora that took place, as well as maybe Omar and others can address the political economic reconfiguration that took place shortly after, not after Assad died, because there was a period of consolidation that was about 1, 2 to 3 years that had to take place before new forms of reforms, whether it was the private banks, whether it was deregulating currency, or whether it was the dubious social market economy that was announced after the regional command meeting. So I'd like to move to this part and see what everybody has to say about that part, and then we'll end with a discussion of the precursor to the uprising. We're not going to get into the uprising very much because first, there's no time, and it will actually end up colonizing the entire discussion. So we'll address it as we exit. But I'd like to ask people about the post-transition period in all forms up to the uprising. So we'll start with Omar.
Thanks, Bassam, and it's great to actually listen to everyone's reactions to your first question and think about the post-succession in light of this. I guess, I'll talk a little bit about the political economic factors and just to sort of shed a little bit of light on a topic that perhaps maybe we can discuss in greater detail in a subsequent roundtable, since there's not a lot of time to go into detail today. But I would say, there's a lot has been written about the sort of neoliberal nature of the reforms that were taking place and at the economic level. But I think at that early stage, there was a sort of a struggle over the economy, over economic, not just economic policies, but almost economic thought. And you could see some of those reflected in the annals of the Tuesday economic sessions that you referred to, if you were to go back and sort of read what was happening throughout the 2000s, but especially at this early period. And I would say that there was definitely the line of the old school public sector Ba'ath Party faction that wanted to, at any cost, maintain that old model that seemed to be exhausting itself, right? Because it had always, for the most part, relied on rents, whether through oil or external aid or grants and so on, and seemingly exhausting itself. And the rising, neoliberal business networks that you and others have, you, Bassam, and others, and Lisa as well, and Ibrahim, and others have written about in various ways. But there was a third line, which I guess you could call developmentalist, in some sense, social democratic developmental. I don't know if social democratic is the right term, but which was represented by, for example, Islam al-Zaim. and which you can see their legacy in the. There were hundreds of experts who worked with Essam Zaim on the Syria Vision 2025, the 10th five-year plan, where there was an alternative vision. There was a sort of a third path potentially at the political economy level that did not, that was not the old school public sector and was not the new liberal path. And ultimately, as we all know, that third way lost, that third way was crushed. And what you saw emerging, I think, was an interesting, and I've been thinking recently that it's almost a precursor to some of the economic models that are post-neoliberal in the sense of crude market accumulation on non-productive means, accompanied by some semblance of a welfare state, even though it's diminishing and it's receding. But it wasn't privatization of state-owned enterprises. It was the expansion of markets for the private sector without that full transition. And I think, you know, I think there's a lot of discussion among the political possibilities that were shut down. And I think I'm curious to actually rethink and think more about the economic possibilities that were shut down at that time and revisit those debates and see, were those possibilities actually possibilities, or were they simply that there was a group of, you know, intellectuals like Essam Zaim who had these modernizing thoughts that were simply institutionally not tenable given the structure of the regime, that there was no way for them to succeed. And I think that debate is actually as crucial to understanding the uprising as the shutting down of the salons and the shutting down of those political discussions in terms of the implications on what came next.
Thank you, Omar. Let's move to Ibrahim. You're muted. Barhum, you're muted.
Yes, I was trying to force you to say Barhum. You said it anyway. I'm still muted.
لا هلا منيح بس
Okay.
إذا أمكن.
I said I was forcing you to say Barhum, and I succeeded. You said it. So I was there. I mean, I covered the whole story from almost from A to Z. I mean, the succession and Damascus Spring. I'm not trying to give any justification, because I know now it's very sensitive to make this link. But yes, of course, there was this big struggle between the reformists or the modernizers or the new guards and the old guards and the hardliners within the regime. It was very obvious to me, and I saw it and I reported about it. And I could sense, I saw, and I firsthand that there were a lot of people within the regime were against Damascus Spring and the whole this phenomena. I mean, this movement which started in the 90s. But now, when I think about it, like after now 20 years, I think in a way there was a link between what was happening in Syria in terms of the dynamics within the regime and what was happening in the whole region. You know, when Bashar came to power, July 2000, just a few months after, I think September 2000, there was like the second Intifada. And then 1 year after, 9/11. And then 2 years, I mean, 2003, there was the invasion of Iraq, and then 2 years after the assassination of Rafik al-Hariri. So I think when I look about it now, I think there was a clear, I mean, there was a link between the crackdown, the fact that the hardliners started to win within the regime, with what's happening outside. And the most obvious example of that was the Damascus Spring. When Riyad Saif and Ma'mun Hamsi were arrested, that was, I think, September 2001, and just a few days before that, 9/11, but they were not released. I think that time, the regime some people within the regime, because at that moment, the American administration, I think, started to open secret channels with Damascus. So for the regime, some of them thought that there was no need for any kind of reform or modernization. We just could do business the same way that we used to do before. And we have great security sharing with the Americans, and there's no need for any kind of opening inside. But I think the big change was, if I'm not mistaken, was 2003, which exactly changed the whole calculus of the people within the regime. You remember after the invasion, and you remember, Bassam, you, because you went to Baghdad and you did this great movie, and we met and we talked about this a lot at that time. After the invasion, some American officials, I think Donald Rumsfeld, the former Secretary of State, he said, like, after Baghdad, we would use Baghdad as a model, and then he said we would go either to left to Damascus or right to Tehran. So the threat perception in Damascus was very, very high, and like the people, the officials, the young guards, the new blood within the regime who were calling for any kind of modernization were on the defensive, because the threat perception was very high. And suddenly, I think I mean, at that time I was arrested, I was in jail, I mean as indication. And at that time, like, you could see that the hardliners were winning, and the regime gradually again and again doing, once again, business as usual. 2001, they were doing it for believing that they could do it by cooperating with the Americans. 2003, they did it because, like, they believe, okay, there's no point to do any kind of reform, and the only way is to resist and to survive, and, which is interesting, and to get closer to the Iranians and to distance themselves from the Arab states in the Gulf, or Arab, like from Egypt and from Western countries, get closer to Iran and work together to face this threat, which was coming from Baghdad. And in a way, they won. And then the third big change was the assassination of Rafik Hariri, which was, again, like, gradually you would see this gap, this window of opening was shutting down. The hardliners are winning, and the regime is doing business as before, in a way related to what was happening in the whole region. I mean, like, the event that I mentioned already, and of course the other big event was the failure of the whole peace process, end of 90s, the failure of Camp David negotiations with the Israelis and the Palestinians, all together pushed the regime to be closed, strengthen relations with Iran, and do business as usual.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Basil, or wait, you're a Zeno, so Lisa, sorry. Please go ahead with any comments you may have. And I must say that your, as many know, your book, which described the period prior, for the most part, was instrumental in basically unveiling, or can we still use the word unveiling, in addressing this cult of personality, which was very difficult to survive. So if you want to address that in any way, that's fine. But if you want to talk about other things, that's fine too.
Well, let me start with what your initial question was, and in that context, I'll address some of the invitations that have come through the conversation we're having. So when the inauguration happened, you, Bassam, mentioned this in your introduction. Western pundits were basically split between those who thought Bashar al-Assad wouldn't be able to hang on to power and those who thought he would be the reformer that human rights organizations had advocated for. And I suspected from the get-go that the situation was much more complicated, I'm sure we all did, than either group acknowledged. And of course, as Ibrahim just pointed out, there were also historical shocks to the system that enabled some of the hardliners to reconsider consolidate their power. That starts with 9/11 for sure, which provides cover for the Syrian regime to keep people who had been involved in the salons or fora in prison, and 2003, where the move is towards Iran, and of course 2005, the assassination of Hariri and the retreat from Lebanon, all enabled Bashar al-Assad to consolidate his power in ways that spoke to some of the historical mechanisms of social control that I talked about in ambiguities of domination, namely the conditions of a durable autocracy whose reliance on single party rule and omnipresent security apparatus, and to some extent flagrantly fictitious claims, or at least hyperbolic claims, all were used as mechanisms of social control. But as my new book points out, there were also in the first decade of Bashar al-Assad's rule an avowedly upbeat, modern, internet savvy authoritarianism. And Omar was talking about neoliberal autocracy. And one of the things that interested me here is that the institutions and rhetoric relied less on party mechanisms of social control, even with the kind of external shocks we saw, and more on an array of cultural producers with their highly vaunted expertise as technocrats, along with regime-oriented, market-driven language that was reminiscent of the IMF and the emergence of civil society, and a kind of youthful voluntarism that was picked up on. And one of the things that interests me about neoliberal autocracy is that it implied two contradictory logics of rule. The one cultivating desires for market reforms, upward mobility, and consumer pleasure, and the other tethering that advancement opportunity to citizen obedience and coercive regulation of the kind the hardliners were interested or invested in. And this contradiction, at least if you're interested in rhetoric and symbols as I am, was mediated and managed in pre-uprising Syria, in part through a local image world that wedded private capital to regime control in a way officially epitomized by the seemingly glamorous, urbane, and assertively modern first family, packaged as members of the moral neoliberal class, both to Syrians and to a global audience. So in addition to the mechanisms of compliance or social control that we were used to from the Bashar al-Assad era, there were additional mechanisms of social control that were more complicated, that required a rethinking of people's political attachments, if you will, and that came to bear on people's decision-making in the context of the uprising. And as Kati El-Hayek said originally, there was also a sense that her generation, Mafi Badil, I think that became much more prominent as Ibrahim was talking about in 2003 and 2005, the regime was able to consolidate some of its power, and certainly no one wanted either the prior Lebanese experience or the Iraqi experience. And the regime was able to capitalize on that move, in addition to other ones, to produce a kind of three-pronged approach to what I call, following Lauren Berlant, the good life. Some of that is about consumer prosperity, but some of that is also about a certain kind of multicultural or multi-sectarian accommodation. And some of that is also about the preservation of a certain kind of national pride and boundaries that enabled Syria to thrive as part of a more rejectionist, less imperial front. Of course, at the same time that they were working with the Americans on and off throughout this period.
Thank you, Lisa. In addressing this point, did you say implications of a durable autocracy or implications of adorable autocracy?
Durable.
Okay.
Durable. I
want to
would
make sure.
Adorable autocracy, but Sam, there's nothing adorable about autocracy. You're adorable.
Habibti, I'm joking. Okay.
No,
Thank you.
durable autocracy, excuse me.
Okay. We have Basil next. However, Ibrahim has to be at an editorial meeting in a few minutes. So he asked if he could say his last words, not his absolute last words, but his last words on this roundtable. So do you mind, Basil, if you let Ibrahim do this and then proceed? Okay.
Of
Shukran.
course, thank you.
Tfaddal, Ibrahim.
Sorry, Basil, sorry, and thank you. Yeah, I mean, just because really I have to be at the editorial meeting at 7, about the front page and on my newspaper. No, just I would like to say a few words before because I know that you're going to address now. Where are we now after 20 years? I mean, on 10th of June, I did a big analysis about how Syria was and how Syria came after 20 years. Because I wanted to focus more about the geopolitical dimension of Syria. I mean, in 2000, as I said, top leaders from different blocs, contradicted countries, contradicted blocs, came and attended Assad funeral to 10th of June. The Syrian army was in Lebanon. Syria was intervening in Iraq in a way, Jordan. They had good ties with the Saudis, with the Egyptians, with the Iranians. Damascus was hosting at that time all leaders of Palestinian factions, all leaders of Iraqi oppositions, and leader of PKK of Turkey, Abdullah Öcalan. So but at that time, Syria was a regional player. You could tell, you could see it. Even like I was based in Damascus, I used to cover Syrian affairs, but at the same time I had to cover Iraq affairs, Bahraini affairs, like Palestinian affairs, Kurdish affairs, because a lot of leaders, a lot of files being discussed in Damascus. Now in 2000, when I look at Syria now, what do I have? As of today, we have 5 armies are involved in Syria. We have the Turkish, the Russians, the Americans, the Iranians on the ground, and we have the Israelis on air attacking Syria every now and then. The latest was 2 days ago. Syria is out of Lebanon. Most of the Palestinian, Iraqi, Kurdish leaders are not in Damascus anymore. Actually, nobody goes to Damascus. Syria is Damascus is under isolation. The government controls just 63% out of the whole Syria. So, in short, Syria, as I said, I wrote this. What I wrote, Syria has moved. I mean, Syria was a regional player in 2000, and in 2020 has become a theater for regional players and for international stakeholders. And that tells a lot about how Syria has changed in the last 20 years. And yeah, this is what I just wanted to say before I go. And thank you so much, Basilos, for giving this time. Thank you. And thank you, Bassam. Thank you for everybody. And I'm really sorry for leaving early, but I couldn't. I tried to change it, but I couldn't. I have to be in different meeting just right now. Okay?
No
Thank you
worries.
so much, guys.
Shukran.
Enjoy.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim, for joining us. Basil, tfaddal.
Yeah, I don't want to reiterate many great points were already raised by Omar, Lisa, and Ibrahim, and you, of course. So to reflect upon the last 10 years, not last 10 years, the 10 years before the uprising, basically the first decade. Yeah, basically one of the things that I was in college, so my political personality started to be developed around that time, because there was again the first Intifada, the post September 11, the invasion of Iraq, and you have Lebanon, the assassination of Hariri. And you have an influx of many displaced Lebanese coming to the university. Actually, when we were in the university, many of them have been given accommodations. And so all this creates a kind of interest and a sense of pride. There was a sense of pride, but at the same time, there was a kind of contradiction that we were living under. On the one hand, we agree, like I as part of that generation, was agreeing with that policy that the regime of Syria took against the invasion of Iraq, supporting Lebanon against the Israeli invasion and attack on Lebanon. So I agreed, as many generation, my generation at the time. However, the regime lived off these external challenges to pacify any movement. It seems to us as if this was a necessary sacrifice to protect our country, and our rights have been relegated to the second place. But sooner or later, because Bashar promised us in 2000 that, and it was really different speech from like well crafted and different from what we used to, about talking about imperialism, Zionism all the time. But this one was about us, and he admitted that there were some mistakes. And this is the first time around that time we ever heard that, oh, there's someone in the regime said like there were mistakes committed by the previous regime, so he is willing to fix that. However, then all these wars served the regime. And let's remember something, that one of the earliest challenges that Bashar faced was in Sweden. In November 2000, there was an uprising and confrontation between farmers and shepherds, and which interpreted as Druze versus Bedou. And around 20 young students and civilians were killed. Over 100 have been injured because of the harsh response. And then we have in 2004, the uprising by the Kurds after a football game, which was in part fomented by a chant to support Saddam Hussein. So the external dynamic can be separated from internal dynamic, and how the regime, or let's say the old guard, capitalized on that to justify harsher measurement and social control. The second point that I want to say is we started to see cosmetic changes, but symbolically significant changes. One of the things for someone like me from a generation who grew up under Hafiz al-Assad, we used to go to school by wearing military suits. Like that was for both genders. And that shaped our identity as militarized subjects in that state, waiting for a war to happen since you are a baby, and that war isn't happening. And there's an emergency law since 1960s. So he changed that. So we started by the time my sister was in school, she was having a nice dress, which is civilian. The second thing, we didn't see any statues erected for Bashar al-Assad. That's in stark difference in terms of what we used to. And we started to see a proliferation of slogans that pride Syria based on cultural heritage and archaeology. And as an archaeologist, that meant a lot for me, and this is different. And one of the main things that was new, it was the governmental, non-governmental NGOs. So under the Asma al-Assad, or the first lady at the time, so we started to see this nice faces all over the places, and that changed the dynamic, how we see ourselves and the social dynamics. The second thing about cosmetic changes, which is relevant to the emergence of a new elites after restructuring the socio-economic conditions in Syria. So we used to be familiar with names like Shalish, Khaddam, Tlas, and now there is a new name that like Makhlouf and Hamsho. And I never heard of them before that, but immediately after 2000, these names popped up. And to reach a point that there was an increasing, this is in tandem with what was happening in Iraq, we started to see an increasing, I was in Damascus for the whole decade around that time, increasing religiosity in the society. And our interest was in the question of secularism. And one of the major things that happened around that time in 2009, there was a leaked version of a very Islamist version of a personal status quo. And it was used actually, I think by the regime or someone leaked that. But we were for a year actually obsessed in challenging that. And so the generation during college, after college, who grew up under Bashar al-Assad were concerned with the question, because we have the question of political rights was off the table, and we have political interventions and nationality and nationalism and solidarity resistance, and we have increasing religiosity and jihadism. So our concern, we started to hear the stories about rising sectarianism in Iraq, and this interaction with refugees and displaced Iraqis in Syria had a major effect, at least on me and others who had these social interactions, that the fear of when the center of power is collapsed and they had a bath party, we might be haunted by same stories. However, the myth of Olga, so when Bashar gave, I will conclude with this, when Bashar gave his first speech on March 30, 2011, to be honest, many claims that they expected that he isn't going to do anything. I was one of the people who supported the uprising, but I was hopeful that this is the golden chance for Bashar al-Assad to capitalize on that and actually kick out all these old guards, which was a wishful thinking, and to declare that we punish them. We are using this moment to do the actual reforms that I promised you in 2000. And thus came the, if you remember, the decree about granting citizenship for the Kurds later and others, which was promised like in 2004. So yeah, I will conclude with that. So that was a self-debunked strategy by Bashar al-Assad, that there wasn't an old guard. He was the old guard. The restructure of the system, there is the moderates have been already alienated. And he basically, now we are living under path dependence. The speech that he did around that time mobilized more people, even those who believe that he was a reformist, which was a disappointment because it's stemming from a wishful thinking rather than from an actual analytical stance. And that's, and the rest is history.
Shukran. Thank you, Basil. I'll move to the, before I move to the last section, which is basically how did we move from the first 10 years of rule under Bashar to a devastating conflict that claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of Syrians under the eye of the regime, which means that this happened not as a function of what happened in 2011 and 2012 and 13 only, because that also had its own dynamic, but it also happened as a result of 40 years of various forms of repression, ending with the last 20 years or 15 years before 2010 with an additional form of repression, which is, or exploitation, which is economic or socioeconomic, which Syria had before the 1990s, but in a sense there was some sort of balance whereby almost everyone was equally repressed economically, or equally to an extent enduring socioeconomic problems. After the mid 1990s or the early to mid 1990s, you began to see a sort of um, uh, uh, a serious decline in the sort of social safety nets that protected a majority of Syrians, or definitely a plurality of Syrians. And we're talking here the whole time, we're talking today, generally speaking, but it's also important to understand that Syria, like any other country, is made up of various regions, made up of the countryside and the city, as well as broader, bigger metropolitan cities. And these have to be taken into consideration in any kind of thinking about what happened in Syria and why, and how did things develop in particular locales. So what I want to say about the Bashar years, and of course I have to summarize greatly here because of the time factor, is that the at the level of political economy, at the level of distribution of wealth and perhaps even happiness across various groups and classes and communities and regions, the old and the new commitments the regime made from the 1990s until 2010 to privileged members of the business community, as well as privileged members who are now the offspring of officials that actually commanded a significant portion of the private sector and controlled, if not owned, significant portion of the public sector because of the way the public and private plays out in Syria. As a result of that, we saw a continuous, gradual disenfranchisation of the majority of Syrians, starting in the early 1990s, and some say a little before, up to 2010. And I am not saying that this was an automatic mathematical scientific moment where uprising erupted because the uprising were spurred by the domino effect or the demonstration effect regionally. But the level of mass discontent at the social polarization that took place in Syria from the 90s up to late 2000, which was accelerated under Bashar as a function of the regime's or his inability to slow down the process through the balancing act or to rein in not just the members of the business community whose capital was necessary to maintain what the regime thought would be the economic wheels of the nation or of the national economy, but also um, the own their own insider power of people that, as we have seen of late with Rami Makhlouf, to be able to balance this question of how the power of capital was beginning seriously to challenge older forms of power or more traditional forms of power. And that dynamic was going to play out in the absence of an uprising. But in many ways, the uprising actually short circuited what in other countries and late developing countries and elsewhere, where we saw the growing power of capital competing and then subordinating traditional power because of the fact that traditional power required these economic engines. And then, of course, the balance tipped at some point. So the short of it is, in my view, under Bashar or the years under Bashar's rule in the past 10 years or before the uprising, we saw the balance tip in many ways towards a near complete rejection of the socio-economic formula that Syria adopted, whereby the repression that existed before, even if in different forms that are more, camouflaged or more manicured, persisted nonetheless. Political repression persisted, while forms of economic safety nets began to dissipate. And in the absence or in the dire lack of this second factor, many Syrians had very little to hold on to, and they were basically sitting and either waiting or emigrating, leaving the country, until, of course, the opportunity presented itself, and that had its own dynamic in 2011 in December in Tunis, but then January and February 2011. So we began to see the outcome of this process. Nonetheless, it is very important for us to recognize that absent the regional protests, uprisings, and revolutions, Syria may not have erupted at that moment, though it could have probably erupted down the line. But it's important to see this not as an inevitable outcome in 2011, because things were deteriorating, but the uprisings elsewhere exacerbated that process, and Syrians looked around, or many looked around, and at least the majority of the disenfranchised Syrians, especially outside the metropolitan cities, and I'm not even talking about the drought and its effects here. I'm talking in general, were actually had very little to hold on to. So I'll stop here and I'll ask people to share with us their last comments, maybe 1 to 2 minutes each, so that we could wrap up. And it doesn't seem that this discussion has elicited a lot of Facebook questions. However, if there are questions, we can address them. Omar, because you are first on the list, we'll start with you, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. So some final thoughts. I mean, I guess, I think there are lots of things to say, but one of the things is picking up on what I guess one of the things that Basilia said and what you mentioned is, I'm interested in some of the thinking about how we think about that period that doesn't take what's happening now and projects it backwards and tries to analyze everything from the lens post 2011, which I think is an analytical mistake that's often made now, because there's so much more knowledge production about Syria since 2011 of people who, some of whom had long experience with the country, some of whom didn't, unlike you and Lisa and Ibrahim. And I think there is, I would say this issue of knowledge production is a problem. And it's expected in a way. Even if you read what some of the prominent dissidents who write about Syria, the way they were writing about the regime today, as it was then, is not the way they wrote about it and analyzed it before 2011. How life was like in Syria before 2011, before the uprising, daily life. I think there's an issue of how do we think about that time period for Syrians that is somewhat lost since 2011, which isn't to say that all there aren't continuities and there aren't important lessons, not just about internal dynamics, but as Basilia said, as Ibrahim said, the regional pressures and the regional dynamics and how they interacted with the politics inside the country to create a certain outcome. That aspect of it, of course. But I would say, Calivas and Susan Woodward have said that we need to separate the causes of civil war from the causes of violence in civil wars. They're not one and the same thing. And I sort of agree with that, although in Syria we can, of course, point to the nature of the regime and point to the violence that was there throughout, before even 2011, for the decades preceding it. But I think, there is an issue, I think, of trying, as I said in the beginning, to project backwards from where we have today. And I think going back and trying to recreate and thinking about that time period, and, in my, personally, I'm interested in that economic sense, but even in the sense of the political discussions that were taking place and the possibilities of that time, might be an interesting thing to discuss and to think further about. Of course, ultimately, we're in a country, as Brahim said, that went from projecting its power regionally to being incredibly dependent. And this is something to think about now from an analytical perspective. In what ways is Syria dependent now, and dependent on whom? And that's something perhaps for future roundtable.
Thank you. Is Cathy available? If not, let's move to Lisa.
Thanks. I'll be very brief. I'm not exactly sure. There's so much to say. There's so much richness in this discussion. Let me just make 3 quick points. The first one is one that works off of Bassam, what you were saying about basically the kinds of inequities that were established or cultivated under the Bashar al-Assad regime in the first decade of rule. And I just wanted to complicate that a little bit by suggesting that in the 2000s, as you know better than I, so it's almost more of a question, there were circles of privilege that expanded and contracted at the same time, resulting in some countervailing tendencies that congealed some differences, like the gap between rich and poor widened, with more people appearing more prosperous in both major cities, while producing new bases for both inclusion and exclusion. And I think thinking a bit more with everyone else about the contradictions of that first decade, where it's not obvious that the places that had the most economic grievances, or where the kind of social pact that had characterized the 70s through the early 90s had existed, were the ones that were the first movers, for example, in the context of the uprising. So often if we think about the political economy, there's a kind of one-to-one correspondence. And I think class relationships were much more in flux than that suggests, and that in many ways the pattern was, there wasn't a clear pattern. Second of all, I just wanted to say something about what Basilius had mentioned about the kind of disappointments that had been cultivated over time, where these reforms are endlessly deferred, promises made and not kept. And even at the beginning of the uprising, there were folks who thought, well, now he's got to do it. And this will empower him as opposed to, you know, his father's old guard. And people were, I think, quite surprised. And even in those moments of cognitive dissonance, there was an effort to smooth over or explain away some of the brutality among a certain sector of the population. Well, he's terrible and he's an idiot, but she's great, for example, about the First Lady. And that leads me to the third point, which is one of the things that I've thought about a lot in the context of the uprising, both the exuberance of the heady days and then the devolution into civil war, is the way in which people can know things and not know something at the same time. And for me, thinking about ideology not as a party platform, but more as mechanisms of social control that are about, or that require, that entail containment, displacement, and disavowal, I know very well, and yet nevertheless, help the regime survive the brunt of challenges that were lobbied against it. And I think that's an important thing to be thinking about also, given the panel's interests in authoritarian resilience and the possibilities for a political otherwiseness to this moment.
Thank you, Lisa. We'll move to Basil, but let me very quickly address the point you complicated, because I truly believe that the constellation of factors that we could observe by the late 2000s is extremely complex, and it's very difficult to draw causally anything from that in order to understand how the uprising started or who started it and so on, because historically, as you know, Lisa, from many previous experiences of uprisings and revolutions, it's not necessarily always those who are most harmed that necessarily start or lead or end up taking over. A lot of factors actually enter into the equation. But and this is why it's important to look at sometimes more not just those lines, but also the data, which does reveal that between 1990, or let's say 1988, 87, like their late 80s, and 2010, there is a clear line in terms of the data that reveals that disenfranchisement in ways that comports with economic, institutional, and political depreciation deterioration and what have you, even if other forms of factors have actually not been as consistent. But ultimately, the majority of Syrians have not, and this is precisely the argument from the other side, if you will, that basically says, look at the 2000s. They were, you know, the years of plenty, the years of opening, and so on. Well, yes, if you are a particular person living in a particular place, doing particular things with particular people, having a job, and so on. But for the majority of Syrians, the data is unequivocal in terms of these indices. And and I see in your book you actually highlight this quite well in the most recent book, authoritarian apprehensions, where you know this dichotomy is or can be confusing to an external observer. But in reality, those indices, these data throughout the 2 decades does reveal that Syrians were not protected, or didn't feel, the average Syrian felt less and less protected by the state, with no option or opportunity, or less options and less opportunity to actually make it, even if the glitter, which I call it glitter in my book, the glitter of the new cities is shines much brighter. So I just want to address that point, because while we could look at causality in many ways, ultimately the data is not too unclear. And I'm not even mentioning or bringing to fore the data on poverty and absolute poverty, which in Syria didn't exist to anywhere close to this extent in the 80s and 90s. So yeah, in summarizing, this is sort of what I'm referring to as, you know, hard data. But the argument, and of course my interlocutors and I have talked about this extensively, which is part of what I'm writing right now in my existing effort and book, which is, it becomes difficult to sort of, as Omar said, to in retrospect, to reconstruct. You actually have to, I think it's much more productive to look at what we were writing and thinking, like literally in 2005, 6, 7, 8, 9. And that's when you see and realize that we were actually speaking of this kind of deterioration, which was quite complex. And it's not just economic. I did focus on the economic, perhaps, or the socioeconomic. So I just wanted to address that, because I don't, and I'll consider this my last word, because I don't want to take up more time. Uh, but if I don't know if that clarifies, Lisa, what I was intending to bring up. But you can address that if you like, and then
Very,
others.
I think we're in more agreement than disagreement, but I do think it would be fun to have another conversation about this. And as you rightly point out, first movers and people with abiding grievances are very different things, for sure. And I did not mean to suggest by any stretch of the imagination that people weren't suffering under Bashar al-Assad, or that a lot of that suffering was also economic and based on certain kinds of inequities. And of course, the world itself, we haven't spoken about this, but the demise of the Soviet Union and the erosion of 5-year plans where the state was the addressee for people's moral and material entitlements. That's also, as Ibrahim would pointed out if he were still here, a global phenomenon as well, which Syria suffered as well as other places.
Absolutely. I actually, one of the reasons I shared with everyone, and this is off topic, that we didn't want to really get into the uprising, because it would have totally taken over the discussion. And I will follow your suggestion and lead, and we'll try to have another, like part 2 maybe, of basically which addresses the uprising and after, because that's really exciting, and we'll see if all of us can rejoin. Thank you very much. Basil?
Yeah, I will be quick. So I would agree with Omar. There's a risk that we are seeing in terms of the knowledge production about Syria. And even when you conduct interviews like with other Syrians who lived through the pre-2011, there is a tendency driven by ideological motivations by either depict the period as a dark, harsh, Orwellian, everything was bad, everything was horrible, everyone was just waiting for the moment of 2011 just to join the uprising, and that's it. So it was inevitable in that sense. And then on the other hand, those who uh, two categories. So those who were loyalists to the regime from the very beginning depict everything was good. Some mistakes have been done, but it could have been fixed. But because we are facing all these imperialist, plots and conspiracies, we have to prioritize our national sovereignty and dignity at the expense of everything else. And later or sooner or later, the regime will deliver. So this is one category. But the second category, because they lost everything, because they were better off before the uprising, or because they lost beloved ones, or because they have become displaced or lost their job, or they were doctors in Syria and became just displaced with barely speaking any language in the host country. So all this creates an your imagination about what Syria in their mind used to be and how they were either better off or worse off. So this is one thing I'm raising that because there is a tendency, despite the proliferation of writings on Syria, is either to depict everything in this way or to continue this story from the prism of the uprising. So because the Syria is basically precluded now, no one can go and conduct ethnographic field work, serious work, because of the risk from the regime, but also other challenges. Uh, so there is we scholars became highly reliant on what's being said outside Syria without observation or relying on basically big data. For instance, send surveys to thousands of people inside Syria. Do you think you are Sunni or Alawite, and how you see the conflict, and then use some literature, then run coefficient, and you'll find, oh, we have significant correlation between being, for instance, an Alawite supporting the regime or a Sunni supporting the uprising. I think there's a big issue with this, and it doesn't resonate with the experience of people there at the time, and also how identity and identification is very complex relational processes that continue to be. It's not just happened in the past and we stopped. And class is very, very important marker of identity. By highlighting other markers and overlooking how class shape the relations of people. And I will here conclude with the point that raised by the politics of disavowal, and I know very well, and there is interesting debate until now whether the uprising was erupted thanks to the March 15 movement or the March 18 movement. And this is a serious debate, whether it was raised by middle class, upper middle class, Damascene, or educated in Damascus in the center because they heard some call on Facebook and had an actual sit-in and protest, or it's because of accumulation of events that happened in Daraa and erupted on March 18 with the basically killing of the first martyrs or the first victim of the uprising. So I think this is an interesting debate, but there is a risk always to reread the history from the prism of the moment or the present. And this is also applies to archaeology and anything else.
Thank you, Basil. And we actually are going to hit the 90-minute mark in about 3 to 4 minutes, which we promised we will have 90 minutes. We did start a few minutes after 2 or after 1. We have a couple of queries actually that came through different I don't know why some people sent an email and others tweeted, but we have one question on Facebook from Diana Bashur uh, that says, bringing the discussion to today and given the dire economic situation, how do the speakers assess today the loyalty of Syrians who have maintained support since the uprising? And I'm assuming that is a question about why do Syrians, despite all, or some Syrians, still maintain support, I'm assuming, for the regime. Now, I will ask my colleagues here, would you like us to take this question now very quickly, or would you like to add this question to our discussion of the uprising in a later event that we will invite you all to, and continue in a more detailed way, so we don't just brush off the question with very quick responses. So we are actually live deliberating democratically. Walhamdulillah. Any?
I think it's a important question, and I don't know if we can do it justice now.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to think about, and maybe if part two of this that can happen sometime, we can take this up among other questions. So I want to thank Diana, who herself, if it's the same Diana Bashur, who wrote an excellent article for Jadaliya a few years back on arms sales to the so-called Friends of Syria to exacerbate the conflict. She was comparing arms sales, revenues from arms sales to spending on refugees by the big arms manufacturers. But I think it's an important question that we can't give its due, but it also depends on when. I mean, I think the question of, these are some binaries that are now taken for granted along the spirit of what Basilis is saying, that we have to problematize of what it means pro and anti-regime. To give you one example, on March 2011, if you were to hold up the banner of the three no's: no to external intervention, no to violence, no to sectarianism, that was considered being pro-revolution, a clear pro-revolution, anti-regime stance. If you were to take that exact same stance 1 year after that and say you haven't changed your principles, you still maintain them, you were considered somehow, at best gray, at worst maybe a fifth column, that you were not all along serious about your opposition to the regime. Just as a small example of what we mean by pro and anti. I mean, in some cases there's a clear sense of who's pro and anti, perhaps, but I think we have to complicate that binary somehow, and maybe we can do it in a subsequent discussion.
Thank you, Lisa or Basil. Would you like to, and just to respect the question, to address it in any way and kind of have the longer part later?
Yeah, I just want to thank you for that wonderful question. And it's a question that I've been thinking a lot about, and indeed have written about in part. And one thing that you've brought to my attention anew is just to interrogate the concept of support. And this is, I think, part of what Omar is saying by undoing the binary, either you're for or you're against, and that there are lots of different reasons in different time periods why somebody might sign up for the regime, and that could be ardent or not so ardent, that could be ambivalent, there can be an interesting or important political toggle between, a desire for reform and an attachment to status quo stability. And so I think it would be great to take this up maybe as the first question in an ongoing conversation that we have again. And just to underscore, echo something Basidius had said, this issue of knowledge production should also be something that we discuss as a group, I think, again, and perhaps with more feedback from our interlocutors on Facebook. I would like to hear more about the kinds of challenges and the ways to meet them in this present period. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. I mean, we did, I personally did anticipate a little engagement because of the topic, the transition of something that happened 20 years ago at a time when people are looking at the catastrophe that has befallen Syria. So I anticipated a few questions, but I think, yes, I think in the next iteration, and I'm assuming we are all now in agreement that we should have one. And there was, I think it was like a threat on Facebook that we must have it. No, it wasn't a threat. It was like somebody really looking forward to it, and I read it as a threat, like you need to have it. So we'll do part two. Basil, did you want to say something that incriminates you before you leave?
Yeah, I will be brief. It's a terrific question, but it's a very difficult question to answer, and depends on the positionality of the person who is answering the question. What we have at risk For instance, one of the things that I'm observing now, the social dynamic between Syrians in post-implementation of Caesar Act to protect civilians. And you will see two or more Syria in the eyes of Syrians. For instance, Arif Dalila gave many talks in a sharp economic criticism of how that will affect the everyday people in Syria without actually damaging the regime. And we have all the comparative analysis that we can use from Sudan to Libya to Iraq to. However, the comments, he was attacked and he was called as a loyalist to the regime and basically referring to his social background and religious background as a prism to analyze why that. So what I'm saying here is loyalty of Syrians to whom? And because even within the one household, we are so divided. We are so divided across. My own family is so divided. And I'm not talking about divided in terms of binary, but very complicated positions across the political spectrum. That doesn't actually resonate with the binary pro or versus against or neutral. But that being said, I think observing that the implication of Caesar Act and the debate around it, and how much we have at risk, what is the kind, because people who left like 10 years ago or 7 years ago, they had experienced totally different social dynamic and political risk in comparison with those who are remaining inside the country. Those who became citizen in a third country, in Germany or in Britain or the United States, they still affected, but they have nothing in comparison with those who remaining inside the country. So I'm afraid we are seeing an implementation of policy advocated by some Syrians outside the country in the name of protecting people inside the country without having actually much to lose. And that's creating a kind of not just disappointment, but frustration that you don't feel us. And we see these accusations, you are outside the country, don't talk about inside. And those who are outside say, we left because we were fighting for dignity and for revolution, and it's not by our choice. And so this is why I'm saying it's very complicated, important, a question that can be answered in one or two sentences, and it's unfolding.
And we will do that next time. I'll just say for my part that on the one hand, I can understand why this question is being asked, although I have something to say to that in just a second. But before that, at this very moment, especially in the past few months, 2 to 3 months, the dire situation in Syria has actually made this question a little less important, not because it's not valid to just ask the question analytically, but because more and more Syrians are just not where even those who had a passive form of support, and I'll talk about support in a second, are actually withdrawing that because of the dire situation today, which is I think unprecedented based on everything that we're reading and watching. But in terms of the word support and loyalty, I'll put loyalty aside. I just want to address the word support, and I hope we can address this more deeply next time. It's very important to deconstruct the word support, even if this seems like just pontification. It's not pontification. The word support is needs to be read anthropologically in context, right? I mean, just think of one thing. Think of how some of the most radical individuals in the United States that want a total overhaul of the system today are advocating publicly to vote for Biden. These people would actually, disintegrate before they would think to vote for Biden in an absolute sense. But there is this idea that, hey, vote for Biden because we need to move away from this status quo. That's just an example. And here, the word support, if you end up voting for Biden, you're not supporting Biden in the sense that you would support Biden if you are a fan. Okay, so So that's just to start the conversation for next time, because the support that is addressed now or before that one can observe is not just a function of this target, it's also a function of the context, the function of alternatives, the function of the unknown as well. There are supporters that are diehard supporters regardless, but it's important to understand the non-diehard component of the support and how it actually fluctuates over time, and which actually created a lot of debates and conflicts and so on. And I would say that the question of alternatives plays a major role here, but I would like to stop here and address the rest of it later, because it's not only a complicated issue, but it's a very sensitive issue that has broken down families, that has broken down friendships, allies, especially on the left, given the intensity with which some positions were taken. I'm not talking about positions of support in the absence of a better alternatives. I'm talking about positions that actually condemned the regime, but were critiqued because they did not condemn it enough. I mean, we're talking about a very parsed out and very sensitive topic, which I feel is very important to discuss in a different forum. And I thank you all so much for being with us. I would like to thank Katie. I know that she had to drop out to take care of
She's with the baby.
a baby. I'd like to thank Brahim, who had to duck out for an editorial meeting, and I wish I was with him, because these things are so much fun. They can only be surpassed by department meetings at universities. Um, and I would like to thank Omar and Lisa, who joined us, and Basil. And hopefully next time we will be able to address this other part, and we will have more engagement, and hopefully we will have lots of controversy and lots of condemnation from people who don't like the opinions of others. And I would like to also thank Mary Kate for helping us set up part of this call early on, and all those people who have been tweeting and contributing to this discussion and conversation in many ways. This was a co-sponsored event between Jadalia and Salon Syria. We will come back to you and announce ahead of time when we're doing this again. Shukran. I'm assuming there are no last words, so I'll say thank you. I'll place the picture of the event on the feed, and say goodbye to everyone. Shukran. Shukran. Thank you. Basil, you can go now. Okay. Salam.